Right. Welcome to the round 8 of Australs 2022. On affirmative, we have Macquarie University 1. On the negative, we have ANU 1. And the motion before the House today is that we, as a centre-left party in a liberal democracy, would explicitly seek electoral gains among less educated voters. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first affirmative.
One second, guys. Sorry about that, AV problem. 1 second. Let me just gather my notes.
Yep, all good.
1 second. Sorry. Yep. All right, we're good to go? Cool. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. During the 2016 election campaign, Democratic staffers tested an ad they loved. It showed Donald Trump looming over a small girl, speaking angrily and saying sexist things, and they thought it was an incredibly persuasive and powerful message. After the loss, they tested that message and they found that that message, in fact, had not worked very well with any of the swing voters in the key demographics in places like Pennsylvania that they needed to win. In fact, it put them off. It made them feel like the Democrats were trying to guilt them into voting for Trump, whom they saw as a moderate because he promised not to cut Social Security. The problem for this other side in this debate is that the natural inclination of the people who run left-wing parties is to run the things that they and other educated people find very persuasive, which is to say quite liberal and left-leaning things, and that means they are less capable of strategizing properly and winning elections. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is provide some setup on who the actor is, what their interests are, what they want to do, and what education polarization looks like. Then I'll make 2 arguments. The first argument is about why not trying to explicitly attract these voters leads you to lose elections because you don't correct for the natural biases that pull the party towards the left. And the second thing I'll do is explain why instead, with a set of things we can do can help us more effectively win elections and narrow the margins when we do, which preserves our hold on power. Firstly, who is the actor? The actor is a centre-left party, which is to say they're not far left. They probably had their origins in the Labour movement. They began as a pro-union party, probably in the 60s or the 70s or right after the Second World War. If we're talking about Europe, they're quite likely, during the neoliberal turn in the early 90s, drifted across and become slightly more market-oriented. They probably hold moderate or, liberal social views, and they're likely, a party like the LP or the Social Democrats in Germany. The interest of this actor is obviously always to win elections, and that's because if they can win elections, they can implement the policy they care about. They can stop right-wing governments from taking control and implementing policies they hate. And obviously winning elections is good for people within the party because it enables their status and their prominence and their access to power to grow. It's quite likely their number one priority would be winning elections and narrowing the margins where those elections can't be won, right? Because you can hold on to the Senate, you can hold on to, minimize the size of the parliament, you can force right-wing governments to moderate, etc. So what do we want them to do explicitly? Obviously, the topic says we want to increase the number of votes we get from lower educated voters. And by lower educated voters, what we typically mean here in the sociology literature is voters who have a high school degree or lower and no university, that did not attend university. So let's just outlay the political landscape here. What does education polarization look like? What this sort of topic refers to is the fundamental shift in developed societies that has occurred over the last few decades, where previously, if you go back to the 1950s, the 1960s, maybe 3 to 5% of the population had attended college, and now it is as high as 35 to 40% of the people who have attended college. There's quite, there's a dramatic change in the way people are. And because of a variety of reasons, in part because of the personality structure of the people who go to college, and because in part when you go to college, you encounter different ideas and a particular sort of space where you sort of form particular views, you tend to be significantly more socially liberal, significantly more cosmopolitan. If you look back at the educated people, like the very educated people in the past, they often had similar social views around, for example, homosexuality, as most people especially who've been to college now. The key shift that's occurred for left-wing parties is their base has been slowly eroded. High school educated people used to be the voting bloc, used to be members of unions who would form the base of these parties, but that union membership has been declining, those parties are declining, and importantly, right, you're talking about the set of people who used to vote very solidly Democrat despite not being, much more than a high school education. You're talking about people who grew up voting for Roosevelt. Obviously, those people are now all dead because of generational change, which replaced the base in a lot of these instances. The second observation we make is obviously, during the 80s and 90s, think about Bill Clinton and the way he marketed himself towards professionals, or Tony Blair even. The reason the similarity is there across those cases is because that's what happened. So what has happened recently is obviously these key lower educated voters have been a key swing block. Think about how Obama won a set of voters in places like Pennsylvania, Trump then won them back, and then Biden won them back again. We will show that Biden was using the kind of policies, or the kind of messaging rather, that we would support. So let's discuss what's going on. Let's discuss what's going on in terms of what happens when you don't try and explicitly attract less educated voters. First thing, I'm going to explain why they're crucially important. And the reason they're crucially important is is for several fold. One, they're obviously still the majority of the population. Two, they often tend to be a key swing voter block and occupy areas that, for example, in first past the post or electoral college systems tend to be very important. Think about Pennsylvania, think about the Midlands in the UK. These are important areas to win if you want to hold a plurality or a majority rather of seats within a parliament. The other thing we'd note here is trying to win over swing voters is obviously far more important than trying to turn out your base, because every swing voter you get counts for two, right? Because you get to not only deny a vote to the opposition, but win a vote for yourself. Depressed turnout doesn't hurt you quite as much. Why is the default of not attracting these voters mean you don't get them? We point to a couple of structural factors. One, the people who work in these parties trend incredibly young and incredibly educated. The average Democratic staffer is 24 and they have a master's degree. Secondly, we'd also point to the fact that highly educated people work in the media the most and work in the highest prestige media outlets that people within the party read. They also tend to consume the most political media, which is to say, it is the people who have white collar jobs who are able to, for example, read the New York Times instead of working, or sort of engage, or often tend to be incredibly online, engaged in an awful lot of online politics, have a Twitter account, etc. And the important thing to realize here is the natural bias of the party pulls the party away, and these people have a set of preferences that are at odds with a set of winning preferences. What are those preferences? One, they favor sweeping reform, but the vast majority of moderate voters, especially low-educated voters, have a strong status quo bias. They're worried about things being go away. They're highly loss averse. They often want things like moderate changes or improvements to healthcare and not sweeping reform. Two, highly educated people tend to demand that their politicians espouse very left-wing sort of framings on questions like sexism and racism. Think of Hillary Clinton's discussion of like intersectionality. Obviously, that was off-putting for many high school educated voters in the Midwest. We also point to the other things. And I just like a key kind of intuition or something to note here is think about the Democratic primary right before COVID. You had promises of trillions of dollars being spent on incredibly vast social programs. You had a promise of every candidate almost promised full and total reparations for Black Americans who are a serious minority, and that would be a political non-starter. There is no way that any of those policies would get across. The reason they were pushing those policies and promising such sweeping, massive reform is what you see on left-wing politics. The reason for that is that's what those voters want, but crucially, it's not what swing voters want. Swing voters often don't want large, sweeping reform. They structurally are very unlikely to do that. They tend to be quite moderate. They tend to, for example, take anti-immigration stances when often highly educated voters have very strong, massively increased immigration standards. They often want things like social moderacy. They want politicians to focus on things like, capping the price of certain pharmaceutical legislation, reforming the healthcare system, making the economy more fairer, and things like that. So what can we do? The basic observation we know is that swing voters and less educated voters actually have, like our policies, but often because of the messaging choices that left-wing parties make, don't realize it. So what we do, instead of prioritizing things like student loan reform, massively increasing immigration, defunding the police, pushing for particular social reforms or massive sweeping reforms, we would instead do things like minimize the amount of change. We would take important symbolic concessions. Think Obama running on an anti-immigration platform or running on, promising not to allow gay marriage, but instead talking about the economy, right? We would also, that's one, issue prioritization one. Two, we would select better candidates. Think Raphael Warnock, who's a pastor who appears constantly in his advertising with police talking about how moderate he is, how much he respects them. Thirdly, it also means things in messaging and advertising and testing things properly and making sure that we get the right things. The only culmination at this point is side negative has to explain why they don't just continually cater to the higher educated people that form now the base of centre-left parties, and two, why they can actually continue in elections, because this group of people are not going away. They're incredibly important, and side negative need their votes incredibly.
Right. Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the first negative.
Checking I'm visible and audible.
Yep.
Yep, awesome. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. At the outset of this speech, I want to note how US focused. Every example Brendan talks about in every piece of demographic, as in the group of people that this team explains at that speech. It is unclear why these sets of trends relate to other contexts, and there's pretty obvious reasons why they do not. The US, in comparison to other liberalized countries, just has more uneducated people. They're more conglomerated in certain areas because it is past industrial base. A series of other countries that moved past that far earlier than the US did, which means those set of people have dispersed around in different areas in countries in comparison to the US. Which means I think this team has attempted at first affirmative to win the debate in the US only. I'm going to engage in that very quickly. But I think the debate occurs far more broadly. It probably occurs in Australia, in the vast majority of Europe. It occurs in New Zealand. It occurs in a series of other contexts that probably do not have the set of trends this team explains. First, on setup, I want to note this team does almost nothing to explain what sort of policies are likely to be used by this centre-left party to target these extra voters. I would propose 3. The first is just you'll spend more time with your political campaigners and your candidates in those areas. So if it's presidential race, you'll spend more time in areas where you think there's more or less uneducated voters or less educated voters, rather than spending them in other areas. I think you'll spend more time advertising in, again, those areas, or specifically targeting with ads on the internet. And I think finally, there's probably some policy change that might occur here. You might be saying more protectionist or something like that because you think that will earn extra uneducated voters. This team does no work to set up what those policies plausibly look like. So I think if you are confused at any point in this debate, you should punish the affirmative team for the lack of setup. Not us. I've at least attempted to explain what this might look like. But I think the biggest problem on this affirmative team is it's basically 8 minutes of imperative. Like, I think the problem is the center left wins in lots of contexts right now. Like they're currently in government in Australia, Germany, Canada, New Zealand, the US, Brazil. Like, I think the vast majority of the context we're talking about, the status quo is center left parties winning despite the problems this team identifies, and I'm going to rebut them in a second, but we just are winning with the current amount of low education voters that we're currently targeting. And I think that identifies that we are currently just winning enough of them, and we don't need to win more of them to win government. Finally, let's talk about the imperative this team has, basically about like leftist staffers and campaigning, circle jerking each other off and being really out of touch. I think the problem here is twofold. First, they do not explain how this is resolved by the particular policies that these parties are likely to do. I think this is actually an explanation of when the center-left, like this very lefty campaigner, goes in and talks to its politician or walks into that area to do some campaigning themselves in some fancy RM boots like the one I'm wearing, and they look out of touch and stupid. You're unlikely to actually change that. They're likely to do the exact thing this team identifies and be like, oh, like poor people or dumb people or something like that, and not actually adapt to those things. But I think far more problematically, this just isn't a problem in other contexts, right? And that is because the way you get up on campaigns, the way you move from like a low-level campaign to a presidential one, the next campaign cycle or something like that, like what your currency is as a strategist is wins. It's electoral wins, which means the set of people that just by random deviation in this team's worst case scenario, randomly deviate away from this set of incentives this team explains, become more centrist, win more uneducated voters, win more centrist voters because they happen to align more closely with the politics of this country for the reasons this team identifies. They are the people that win more campaigns. They're the people that get promoted more often. And I think the problem here is, even if you believe this team's set of mechanisms do exist, this outweighs them. Because obviously, as a politician deciding who you'd like to pick to be on your campaign, would you rather pick the person that has 5 wins in 5 elections, or the person that's won like 2 or 3 out of the last elections, but is more left, which means the set of other staffers you might listen to promote them more? I think that's just less important to you, because the set of people that run campaigns are the people at the top, the people that actually want to win those campaigns. Let's explain why it's very hard to gain additional low education voters. And I think this comparatively explains why conservatives have an advantage here. Then we'll explain why those voters are unimportant. Then we'll explain why this action turns off the current educated voters, your current base you're relying upon, and why those voters are comparatively far more important. Why is this likely to turn off, why is this unlikely to win you additional low education voters, or do so incredibly inefficiently? The first is just, as I point out, you look incredibly fake. A lot of people don't go and campaign in these areas, or they campaign in them far little. That means they don't understand these areas. They don't understand these people. They don't understand their struggles. They walk in looking far too middle class and out of touch. They walk in the fancy boots I explained. That means these sets of people don't look to the people that actually walk around in steel cap boots and do manual labor like real people they could actually empathize with, which means the time spent is poorly used because you don't actually go and talk to these people. Politicians, even in centre-left parties, might have started out as unionists, as this team identifies, but now they're majority middle class, they're majority university education people as well, which means they're unlikely to be able to empathize with them when they spend time with them. Second, the media is likely to be captured in the vast majority of these contexts by more conservative media. That is things like the Murdoch monopoly in the vast majority of, say, the US, the UK, and Australia. And it is in those contexts where that media is more often, or say the ABC in the US, those contexts, that media is far more likely to be free to access, which means those that are poor are more likely to read conservative media just because of that monopoly, but also like high and mighty, like New York Times and stuff like that, is more likely to be kind of like fancy and assholes and basically be like, well, we think we're worth getting paid. So structurally, they're more likely to have pay locks on that. That means you're far more likely as a low education voter to be someone who reads conservative media. Third mechanism, policy from conservatives is just likely to be more simple and more likely to work convincing these sets of actors. That is to say, one, they have to spend more time having very simple campaigns, things like Back in Black, which is just like, we're going to return to a surplus or something like that, and stop wasting all your money. Very simple messages that are very persuasive because they allude to very real things that these sets of people that are most likely to structurally have to deal with, which is balancing their own budget at home. That means a message is like tough on crime or tough on baddies in the international sphere, like, you know, we should be tough on China or something like that, is very powerful. And these simplistic messages are likely to work because these people have less time to spend on politicians. But finally, culture wars are incredibly well run and already ingrained advantages that conservative has. That means every action this team takes fights against a huge war conservatives already have in this context, which means it's unclear how they get any benefits if they're not going to specify it. But these actors are just unimportant. There's very few of them in the country. Even when there's a lot of them, there's less of them structurally over time. You're far likely to win these set of actors already for a series of other things, like their race, their recent migrants, or something like that. Which just means I think these people aren't very useful. There's not enough of them, and they're not going to campaign for you or donate money to your campaign. Let's explain why this is likely then to turn off educated voters, which is the current majority in society in the set of base actors you already rely on. First, these people are at threat of being poached structurally in most contexts. They're likely to be poached by environmentalist parties. They're likely in the vast majority of proportional representation systems, which is both democracies that this debate occurs in. There's likely to be more parties, which means there are likely to be centre parties or left parties that are people that you're likely to be stole from, say the Teals in Australia, are actors that you are scared will steal your base from you. And they're likely to do so particularly well. They're likely to be able to use that campaign time to be like, why are they not spending time in my electorate? They're so out of touch. They're just party people rather than caring about me. And this explains that they're likely to be very sensitive to the amount of time being spent on you. And that's because they spend more time as these educated voters spending time paying attention to politics, which means if you do a very subtle change, it's not likely to be noticed by the people that see your ads less because they're low education and they've got less free time. But those that are very sensitive to this, that have free time, are likely to be sensitive to the slightly less pro-trans views or the slightly less like pro-gay rights views, which means they're likely to change. They're likely to go vote for those other parties. They're likely to kind of spend time campaigning for them or something like that. And that's really harmful because it's in those contexts where you lose governments you already have, where you're forced into coalition governments where you have to compromise on your values and become more leftist or something like that, which is probably not something you care about. But most importantly, these sets of actors talk to other ones. If you win one middle-class voter, or you win one educated voter, they're likely to talk to 3 or 4 others and convince 1 or 2 of them to become voters for you. But they're also just often the median voters in this context. So these actually are the voters you win away from the conservative or centre-right parties. That's how you're currently winning elections in the status quo. I don't know why you bother changing. Very proud to negate.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the second affirmative.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Thanks. I left my green piece of paper.
Yeah, fine. I'm just keeping just mind.
Panel, centre-left parties in liberal democracies across the world, in Australia, in Germany, in the US, and a bunch of other examples that this team best stood by in this debate, should explicitly seek electoral gains among less educated voters. And they should do that for the main three reasons of my speech. The first is that these less educated voters are a significant base in a lot of cases, even if not throughout the entire country, certainly in some seats that can grant you a lot of political power, that they are highly receptive to these attempts as that large group, and so it is a net benefit to try and pursue them. Secondly, that this strategy is something which allows you to get electoral gains with the educated voters who are currently a part of your party, who they will really enjoy this, that they will be big fans of it, and finally, that it meets your party ideology. So firstly, clarifying a couple of things in setup, don't fall for the cheap tactics of this team to try to assert that Brendan only talks about the US. They only do this because they know Brendan loves the US, and they probably wrote that before he even got up to speak, right? Because if you look at notes, literally one of the first words out of his mouth was Germany, and that was just a cheap tactic from this team. What we believe in this debate is that across the world, and as the info slide clearly states, there are a lot of people who are not educated, but there are increasing numbers of people that are highly educated. And what we are seeing is that the people that are not highly educated are in growing numbers in larger and larger swaths with every single election falling to conservative parties. And they used to be our historical right as a centre-left party. They were the mandate that we were created for, and because of our laziness, because of some biases and distortions in the way that we make our decisions, we are bleeding them. We have been shot in the stomach and we are pouring out vitality. We are pouring blood. The countries that they talk about where we are still winning are ones where we have started to explicitly pursue these undereducated people, and we have seen evidence that this strategy works. We must continue to do so. Failure to do so will spell a death sentence for us and a free win for our opposition. Now, why is this something that is going to be that will work with this group of lower educated voters? The first thing to say here is that often they are a very big base of people. There are a lot of people in a lot of countries like Australia, like Germany, and maybe even more so in the US, but it doesn't need to be as bad as America, right? Who don't make it all the way to university. They might be women who are encouraged to have children instead. They might be First Nations people that didn't get properly looked after in the education system and had significant structural barriers against them. They might be people who went to TAFE, who weren't smart or just weren't interested, or were rural, didn't live in a major city, didn't want to move for their education, and just wanted to make money and have a happy life. Those people exist, and they are a big part of the population. This is a group of debaters who might not come from a place like me, where nobody goes to university, right? In rural Australia, it's not normal to move away and go to Sydney and become a debater and do this every weekend, right? There are thousands of people who politicians are leaving behind, and we need to capture them. So they tell you that for 4 reasons we won't be able to capture them. 1, you'll look fake and out of touch because of your choice of shoes, but also more sophisticated mechanisms. Just find the talk of boots very funny in this debate. Secondly, that the media is captured by the conservative media. Thirdly, that the Conservative Party is better at being simple. And fourthly, that the culture war is already won. The first thing to say here is that this group of people are already often naturally aligned with your party's policies. There are a lot of policies within your party that are great for them. That is increasing access to public high schools. That is reducing the expense of education. That is removing funding from rich private schools in the city. That is expanding the quality of vocational education. That is making wait times in hospitals shorter so that your infant mortality rate of your children goes up. That is supporting Indigenous communities and giving them access to things like public housing, right? All of these policies are already a part of your suite, but you're just failing at marketing to these people. You're failing to get that message across to them. And what that's leading to is a feeling of being a little bit deprioritized and unimportant. It leads to a group of uneducated people for whom symbolic mentions can mean a great deal. Often in these areas, people feel like all of the talk is about the educated people and the wishy-washy city folk, and the first person to mention and acknowledge your existence can capture your heart in a very big way. So why is it mutually exclusive that the Conservative party is like trying to do this, so we should just give up and not try. Obviously, we should say, hey, we see you guys too. Hey, we care about hospitals. We don't necessarily only care about forgiving student debt. Hey, we see your problems. And that is not something that is like, they will love that. And they're more likely to love that from you than from the Conservatives, because they are often aligned with the ethos of the people who are within your party. That is to say, like, First Nations people are far more likely to find an accepting community, and LGBTQ people in a community of educated voters, right? It's somewhere that's going to be nicer for them to end up. But finally, in terms of the idea of the media already being captured, fixing and explicitly pursuing these voters involves fixing the amount of attention that you put on things like free media. They just talk about symptoms of not enacting our model, and then they say, oh, therefore it's impossible to fix it. How did conservative media get so popular with people who are uneducated? Because they explicitly did that as their strategy. All we have to do is put a bit of funding into creating more journalists who talk to free media, more articles that talk to these people. That is incredibly easy problem to fix. At the end of this point, I have proven that this strategy works. Now, onto the idea of why these electoral gains are still worth pursuing, even if that's only a minute group, even if they can't be won, because it helps with your educated voters as well. They told you that the big threat in this debate is that your educated voters go to the left, I guess, and they're going to like vote for the Greens or whatever, right? They said that because that they're really sensitive to the amount of time being spent on them, and that they really want to be as pro-left and pro-trans or pro like extremely left things as possible. Firstly, often you won't need to sacrifice any of your extremely left social policies in order to get pursue a big chunk of these less educated voters, right? There are a lot of undereducated people who are gay. There are a lot of undereducated people who really only care about how much money that they bring home in their pay packet. They don't necessarily give a shit like about whether or not like you support certain policies or not. You don't have to be like racist or homophobic to talk to these people. All you need to do is like stop their babies from dying in the hospital and make it easier for them to get things like access to public school and access to public health. Why are these gains worth pursuing them? Firstly, our opposition is explicitly seeking these people so much that failure to match their energy is just going to lead to us losing a base that we have no real excuse to lose, that we're just losing because of laziness. This is really bad because pursuing these electoral gains will not harm our party in any way, because amongst educated voters, it is a commonly understood tactic that multiple bases are needed to win seats in an election and provide them with the policy that they want in their country. That is why when Biden said, I am most capable of beating Trump because I know how to talk to people that are less educated, that all of the really educated people started like foaming at the mouth. They were so turned on by it, right? Because they know political theory, they understand elections, and they can see what you're doing and understand that that is in their best interest. But also, secondly, the strategies of pursuing poor people don't even come at a cost of maintaining your stances that educated people care about so much. Actually, it's going to strengthen your party as a whole, because it means that we have a policy that a lot of people agree with, we fix our marketing problem, and it removes the easiest tool for the centre-right and conservative parties to make gains, which is what really pisses our educated voters off, right? Which means that we have a high-quality argument to the undereducated people, and that the educated people love this political strategy and start chatting about it and getting really excited. It stimulates donations, it stimulates discussions, and it stimulates support. And because finally, this meets the ideology of your voter base. They believe in equity, not equality. They want to pull out people from the bottom of society and allow them to live a better life. That was something that educated people passionately believed in, and why you must vote for the affirmative team.
Right. Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the second negative.
All right, just confirming that I can be heard and seen.
Yep.
Yep. I will be a bit more generous than Tom and acknowledge that this team does talk about countries other than the United States. But unfortunately, that's where the generosity ends for me, because this team uses the words and the language of other countries, but they continue to insist that the context of the United States is the context of all liberal democracies. When we explain to you conclusively that the United States is one of the only liberal democracies left on the planet in which undereducated voters are a meaningful share of the electorate. And even in the United States, those undereducated voters are rapidly decreasing in numbers. They are largely concentrated among the elderly who grew up in a context where college was inaccessible, but now college is accessible, which means that for those voters, often other factors like their age, like their cultural values, are things that the left cannot overcome, which is why when Leah suggests that the way that you do this is you take existing policies, but you market them better, or you spend more time with these groups without explaining what that looks like or why it would change anybody's minds, you ought to believe it doesn't. Because explaining, like putting more ads on Fox News about why healthcare is good or something like that is not going to change the minds of somebody who believes deeply in the cultural values of conservative parties because they're in their 50s or their 60s or their 70s, and that's what they know and understand. It was not enough. This team should have taken a higher barrier, and their failure to do so means that they cannot claim a change that is positive for them in this debate. Understand, though, that they do not respond to the bulk of the contexts that matter. That is places like Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the EU and Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, the most educated places on the planet where access to college and the need to go to college is something that is existential for many people in order to get a decent job, in order to be able to provide for their families, where that share of the population that is educated grows dramatically with each successive generation. This voter base that they talk about and that they care about is a tiny minority in many of those contexts, and a minority that grows more tiny every single year. Why on earth you would pursue a shrinking group over any other demographic baffles me, and I think that it baffles them too. Because a lot of Leah's speech was talking about other people who are within the pool of undereducated people, but not necessarily all undereducated. When she talks about racial minorities or queer people or women or stuff like that, those people, sure, some of them are undereducated, but many of them are not. And you could just appeal to them directly on the basis of their identity. But many of them are rusted on liberal voters anyway, because the center-left parties were the only ones that were willing to protect their rights, which is why Black people in the United States vote so overwhelmingly Democratic, why queer people in many other contexts vote so overwhelmingly center left. This wasn't a group of people that you could claim because, oh, how convenient, they're sort of within the much larger pool of undereducated voters. That was a group you didn't even need to market to, and we already had. Then they talk about people who are rural and that kind of thing. But I struggle to imagine how a center-left party, a party that is often pro-migration, pro-globalization, and happy to allow things like agriculture jobs to move offshore, could possibly appeal to rural voters. Those rural voters were not going to stand for that. But the other thing to understand is that even aside from pure economics, often those rural voters were people who are particularly less likely to be exposed to things like queer people or like minorities, because very few of those people wanted to be in those more conservative contexts, which is an explanation as to why the types of mechanisms that Leah talks about would never convince my extended family, who all live in rural Alberta in Canada, to ever vote for the Liberals in that context. They were always going to vote Conservative because they didn't understand, and they were frightened of minorities. They didn't understand the new values that were existing in the cities, and they felt alienated anyway. Having a Liberal politician from Canada come into areas that my family live in would just be inauthentic. It would feel fake and tokenistic. That would not be persuasive. If anything, it would convince those people more deeply just how much they resent those types of policies, just how much they resent those politicians, and it would remind them of how poorly they are often understood by those elites when they see them face to face, when they interact with them. And importantly, that comes at the cost of voters and a winning coalition, because we tell you at Tom that the center left is not bleeding out of a stomach wound like Leah says it is. The center left is winning across most of the world, and there's structural reasons why it's winning, because the share of education in the voter base is increasing, because populations are growing more diverse and migration is increasing, because people are more aware of the threat of climate change and concerned about it, because corporations have probably finally gotten a little bit too greedy and people are inclined to suggest there should be more redistribution. All of that suggests that you do not need to alter the formula that is already winning you in places like Brazil, in places like France, in places like Australia and in New Zealand. That seems like, and in Canada, that seems like it is just working in the vast majority of the world. And even, of course, if we care about it in this debate, the United States as well. At the end of the day, though, you also have to recognize that in other contexts that are not the United States, there is just not really a problem with center-left parties being too far left to win elections. The reason that that does not exist in other contexts is because the United States is very unique in that it allows a high amount of money to be diverted into politics, and there is just more money flowing, which means that in the US, elites on both sides, so people who tend to be more politically polarized, tend to be able to drag those parties more because they have more money and they throw that money at them. So for example, when it comes to the Democrat Party, they're often skewed by highly wealthy, like doctors, that kind of thing in the US, who donate large amounts of money. But that just cannot happen in other contexts because there tend to be more rigorous campaign finance laws. And the other thing to note here as well is that in other contexts, you tend to be less reliant on staffers because political parties in other contexts tend to just have less money and be less professionalized than the ones in the US, where you have such a massive industry of elections. That doesn't exist in Australia or New Zealand or Canada or the EU or Japan or anywhere else to my knowledge, which means that those staffers cannot have the distortionate effect that they do in the US, where those staffers are young people who are extra leftist and drag the party to the left. In other places, there are just far fewer of the staffers. They cannot distort the party away from the interests of its members, which have far more direct control over them in places like Canada, Australia, and the EU. So that means that the self-moderation argument that Brendan explains does not really, like, there's no imperative to do that in most of these contexts, and that alienates the more educated voters that we tell you about at Tom. Because the thing is, when you're more educated, you can be far more deeply engaged in politics, and you're far more likely to be highly sensitive to things like changes in the use of language. So if, for example, on their side, language stops being quite so elite and starts becoming like, you use less inclusive or less sensitive terms for trans people or for minorities or something like that in order to make your politics more accessible to lower educated people, that is a problem, because it's unlikely that that small change is noticed by those lower educated people or gets you their votes over conservative parties, but it alienates the more highly educated people from that party because they're so tuned in and consuming so much media and discourse. They do notice that, and they partake in the Twitter doom threads that talk about why it is so bad. And those more educated people, importantly, are people who are also more privileged. They actually have the luxury of not going out and voting for these center-left parties, because for them, they can actually just say, well, I didn't like that this party was transphobic. Politics is not existential for me. I will simply stay home. I'm not impressed by anybody this time around, which means then that those people often will just punish you by not showing up if you don't keep maintaining a politics that appeals to them, and they notice it very quickly. But also they do things like pull their donation. They do things like discourage their children from volunteering for your campaign. And often those kids are very important for going out and door knocking, stuff like that. So you lose a group that was going to be instrumental and has been instrumental for these parties when it comes to funding and manpower. But the last thing to notice here then is that this team just kind of gets their mechanisms wrong, because when they talk about like, oh, we need to be kind of more centered, we need to appeal to the median voter, they conflate the idea that a low educated person is the median voter. But in the vast majority of contexts, they're not the median voter. In the vast majority of contexts, they're actually quite far right relative to the average person, because in most of these contexts, the average household in those contexts, in most places that is not the US, and probably even in the US, the average household has one breadwinner who probably does have a degree. The average household is relatively better educated. And so a household or group of people who are all just people who hold high school degrees is actually very far right, not who you should be targeting. You'd be better off to target almost any other demographic that you could say was more median than this one to achieve their benefits, something we could claim, but they could not.
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the third affirmative.
Cool. Can I be? Sorry, can I be heard now?
Yep.
I'm going to start this speech by addressing the way side negative tries to sneak out of the debate. The first way is to suggest that we don't need these voters to win elections, so we can just ignore them. This is obviously untrue. Why is this the case? Firstly, I just want to point to some empirical examples, noting that the average reasonable person is obviously aware of what's happening in the world and would note that these examples are persuasive to them. Firstly, we could look to the United States, which we told you down the bench, where Obama, Biden, and then Trump all won on the basis of uneducated voters in manufacturing areas like the Rust Belt. Secondly, we could point to the United Kingdom, where Boris Johnson won the largest majority in the last 50 years in the UK on the basis of Brexit voters who were primarily uneducated. That's why they voted for Brexit and primarily lived in the Midlands of England. Thirdly, we could look to countries like Brazil, where Lula just won election primarily by appealing to people in the northeast of the country who are poorer, and he did so by appealing to them on the grounds of these kinds of policies. So empirically, their claims are untrue, but let's provide some structural reasoning as well. Firstly, we would just note that it is very likely that the majority of people, for a series of relatively obvious reasons. The first is just that college is incredibly expensive, which suggests that people would be locked out of it, particularly not just because the cost of accessing college is very high, but also because of the opportunity cost of accessing college, right? You can't work while you're at college. If you're pregnant, you can't go to college because you have to look after your child. That applies to the vast majority of people. But secondly, there are barriers to entry in terms of like needing to get very good marks that often mean that you need to have had access to a privileged education prior to that, or tutoring or other services. But thirdly, we would note that just many people live in areas where there aren't often universities, or where there is no normative expectation that you'd go to university. If you grew up in a rural or semi-rural area, no one else around you went to university, there's no universities around you, it never even appeared as an option to you, which is why it is very unlikely that you went to university. Obviously, the level of education is on the rise. That's what this debate is about. But it's gone from a very low number to a still low number. They're still the minority of voters. The vast majority are still uneducated. But thirdly, we point out that even it's not just that the majority, it's that they're very important voters. That is, that they're often the swing voters. This team says, no, they're obviously the most right-wing voters imaginable. It's your boomer grandpa. Well, maybe it could be your boomer grandpa might not have gone to college. There are obviously also other voters who provide a series of reasons to believe why they're likely moderate. One, the fact that they're not educated means they tend to be less politically active, because there tends to be a correlation between being very educated, consuming lots of media, engaging in a lot of political debates. Just look at debaters, for example. And we point out that that really matters, because if you're a moderate, it means you're the marginal voter you really need to pursue. That's the additional people you win to get into office, but also demonstrates that they're important because winning them steals a vote from the other side and gives you a big win there. But secondly, we point out that they often just live in areas that are very crucial electorally. That is to say, if you think about the areas where uneducated people live, i.e. where there's lots of manufacturing or low-skilled jobs, it's often in kind of like areas like the Rust Belt in the United States, or areas like the Midlands in the UK, or areas like the northeast of Brazil, as we point to, which is incredibly important and suggests that these voters do matter. What are the implications of this first argument in the debate? Because they are devastating for side negative. Firstly, it means that since you cannot win elections without winning the majority and a crucial majority of voters, you must engage with them, and side negative must provide reasons as to why they're able to win these voters over despite refusing to engage with them. Secondly, because App concedes that these people often do not vote for you, it means that they cannot get away with their claims that, well, the left will just win anyway through magic, and their insistence that the left does win anyway through magic. When the left wins, it is by adopting the principles of the affirmative team and by explicitly appealing to these voters, which is what we tell you down the bench. They cannot just suggest that, the left wins everywhere. Noting that, for example, they just rely on like the example of Australia a lot. We point to a numerous set of countries where the left is not in power. Italy, Japan, as you might know, Denmark, Sweden, the United Kingdom, etc., all where these principles were not heeded, and as a result, they have failed. But the last implication is just that, the implication of this is they must demonstrate that they're able to win these voters over, which is the next question in this speech. Why is it that we are more likely to win these voters over? We would suggest that, just logically, the team that is attempting to win these voters over is probably going to do a better job at winning them over than the team that is explicitly ignoring these voters and refusing to engage with them. Because that is the stance the negative team must defend, we must be ahead here. But we do provide you with a series of structural reasons as to why we'd be very good at this. For example, we suggest that when you're an uneducated voter, you are often poorer than educated voters, for reasons the negative team seems to concede, that you have access to better jobs and more forms of privilege, which suggests that a lot of the policies we tell you at first affirmative these parties stand for are exactly the policies that we can very easily target at uneducated voters. Raising the minimum wage is likely to be very popular. Increasing access to things like trade schools is likely to be deeply popular. Things like improving hospital wait times, things like prescription drug pricing, all bread and butter left-wing economic policies, unionization, etc. All things we can easily talk about that these people will really like. Side negative's response is just to say, well, often you have some policies they don't like, perhaps their social values disagree with you. That is true. That's like perhaps a reason why we don't win every voter all the time and the left doesn't hold a super majority over everything. But that's a reason why we need to pay particular attention, because these voters aren't just obviously aren't obviously just going to vote for us unless we explain to them why they ought to prioritize those economic issues over those social issues, which is something we can do by explaining why those issues are more important. But we also provide a number of other suggestions that we could engage in here, right? For example, we could prioritize the issues they care about and deprioritize the issues they don't care about. We could avoid talking about things like immigrations and guns that are likely to turn off these types of voters, and instead talk about other kinds of issues like economics that they're far more likely to like. Or we could do things like Obama did and explicitly be anti-immigration. Note Joe Biden himself has implemented many anti-immigration policies in support of that. For example, requiring immigrant processing to occur in Mexico rather than the United States under COVID is a good example of that kind of thing that we'd be happy to adopt. Obviously, politics is about concessions. We additionally point to things like we could target policy at them, we could run candidates they're more likely to like. Side negative's final response to this claim is just to say, attempts to win these voters over will be seen as fake and tokenistic and backfire. Series of reasons why this is unlikely. Firstly, we would suggest that the logic of this team is actually what happens when you do not attempt to win these voters over. You're seen as tokenistic when you campaign in their areas. On our side, we could obviously do things like run candidates they wouldn't feel are unrelatable. For example, we could run working class people so they don't wear the wrong boots in that particular jurisdiction. They're people from their community who they can relate to. We could obviously talk about issues they do care about. We could obviously ignore social issues they do not care about. Those were problems that were easily surmounted, but only when you explicitly bothered to do so. Because as First Affirmative explains to you, the natural tendency of these parties is just to go and talk about those social issues they hate and just to do the left-wing things that the base particularly likes and the donors particularly like, but often these people don't. Final thing I want to address then is just their last Hail Mary, which is this will turn off a sufficient number of educated voters in order to make the trade-off not worthwhile. Why is that untrue? Firstly, just because these voters are less important for all the reasons we tell you, because they're a smaller demographic and they're less crucial to winning, because they're not the swing voters, we'd be happy to accept a trade-off here if it existed, but it does not. Why? Firstly, we still have a range of policies that appeal to them that mean they're likely to vote for us. Two, they're often fine with us focusing on swing state voters because they believe in things like intersectionality, or they're true believers in the party, which means they'll vote for you even if you kind of ignore them a bit, unlike the swing voters. But thirdly, often they have no one else to vote for. In many countries, there is no more left-wing party they could vote for, so they have to vote for you anyway because they want to keep the right out who they really fear. But lastly, we explain that often they make concessions, like they could vote for the more left-wing party, but they know that they're less likely to win election, and because they want to keep the right out, they strategically vote for your party anyway. So you don't need to be the leftmost party, you just need to be the most electable party, which you achieve by appealing to uneducated voters. They say, well, these people are really attuned to discourse, and if you drop trans rights or something, they'll stop voting for you because they're privileged and can afford to do so. But they rebut their own argument, right? If you're a trans person, you can't afford the right to get into power. If you're gay, you can't afford the right to get into power because they're deeply homophobic. You have to vote. You're the most likely to want Trump not to get into office and to do anything possible and to tolerate these concessions in order to keep them in power. Look, you couldn't ignore these voters. They did. We didn't. We win.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Finally, I'd like to invite the third negative.
Cool. I'm guessing I can be heard.
Yep.
Awesome. I just want to make a quick clarification before I get into the rest of my speech here. We are not the side of ignoring undereducated voters if parties are already listening to them in the status quo. We are the side of defending the way that Lula wins elections right now, same side that defends the way that Biden wins elections right now. They need to prove to you that they need to do more than what is going on right now because they're making a specific push for these voters more than is occurring right now. I think Tom set up pretty clearly at first that we are the side of status quo. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do in this speech is talk about why there is a massive opportunity cost, which I don't think affirmative does nearly enough to mitigate throughout their case, and an opportunity cost to well-educated voters. Then I'm going to talk about why this opportunity cost is crucial, because you're likely to be much less ineffective when you're talking to people who to try and win the undereducated voters that they want to focus on. Okay, firstly, what is this opportunity cost? And the first thing I want to do here is a little bit of impacting as to why these people are actually the most important stakeholders in the debate. Because Udai's only thing of trying to claim why they are unimportant is saying they're a smaller group. Look, I'm going to get into why they are not really a smaller group and why they actually make up the majority of most populations that we're talking about in a sec. But But even if you believe they're a smaller group, these are the group with money to help fund your campaign, to donate to it every month, to give you $10 on a large scale, because these are the people with disposable income. These are the people with time, because they don't have to work 2 jobs and instead have a professional job where they can therefore donate time because they're not exhausted, to helping your campaign, to putting boots on the ground and getting things out there. These are the people who talk about politics at dinner party and convince each other to vote for you as well. This is how you win on this basis, right? Because weighing this up here, this money and this time and this campaign allows you to go back and do the types of campaigning that you see in the status quo for low education voters, right? Because this increases your party's capacity with donors, with voters, and to get actual money, and therefore bring it back to campaigning towards people in the first place. Notably, this looks like in Georgia, getting Black people out to vote, or in the southwest of the US, getting Latino people out to vote, right? Who might be low educated, but the reason you have the outreach and the ads is because of the money of the people that you no longer focus on under a negative affirmative team side and necessarily lose. Why is this? The first is just an important piece of contextualization that they basically ignore by saying that people believe in the notion of the parties, which is, particularly right now in the context of environmental and climate crises, there are actually alternatives to the center-left parties popping up in most of the parties here. Their responses are often like, oh, well, you understand that the party will lose if you don't vote for them. But no, this is like the majority of countries in the world are not 2-party systems. This is not the US. Even in Australia, which is a terrible, like relatively 2-party systems, there are still really viable ways you can do alternatives in things like the Senate. So you should believe that the average center-left party probably isn't the Democrats and probably does have to worry about alternatives in proportional representation systems that do exist in these countries. And notably, they're making this push because of the context, because they know that environmental policy in center-left parties often isn't strong enough to really engage with the fact that most educated people really care about these issues, and they know that they can get these voters to switch from them. So at the point at which center-left parties start to ignore these people or spend less time convincing them to try to vote, they just lose their votes because there are other people with incentives to try and get them to vote as well. We would also note that for many other people as well, they can also, if they're dissatisfied with the center left, just move to a center party or a center right party as well, because they have tax interests that are being protected. So if they think their economic interests are going to be better served and they no longer believe in the social interests, they kind of just weigh it off and they go over there. This means that you can lose a massive amount of educated voters very quickly. I would also just note that they just really do care about social issues, right? So in an example of what the affirmative team is probably defending, imagine a center-left party dropping strong environmental policy because it would destroy the manufacturing industry in a certain area of low education voters that they wanted to get votes from, right? Notably, then, that means that everyone who believes in environmentalism, and those are probably people who are relatively well educated because they have a strong basis in science, they suddenly then realize that this party is not defending their interests whatsoever, and they go elsewhere. This is incredibly important because these people deeply care about the things that are important to them, and the moment you stop trying to get their attention, you leave them to the wolves. And that's obviously even worse if you, as they suggest, start changing your policy to make it more appealing to people who ultimately mean that it's now distasteful for the people who will give you money. Again, the weighing on this is incredibly important because these people's money is what allows you to do the things that currently occur in the status quo and search for other voters that way. If they spend, say, 5 extra hours on television ads for people for low educated votes, I'm going to explain it in a second, that's incredibly ineffective, but it comes at the cost of giving up this time for the competition for the wealthy, and that competition is fierce and successful. It's happened in multiple occasions in Australia recently, and it will continue to be successful, I guess, as the climate crisis gets worse. Okay, secondly, why this is inherently going to be effective. Are these people, firstly, important? The first thing I would note is they are just not the majority anymore. University is accessible. Sure, going to Harvard isn't, but community colleges exist in most areas of America the average person goes to and gets a degree. The majority of people live in city, and I would urge you to think if the majority of people, if you came from a city and a majority of the people from your city high school went to university, that's probably the majority of the country as well. Even if they're not a majority, though, they're relatively poor and have less influence on the government. But also, we would note, and we tell you before, that there are alternative ways that you can win groups of undereducated voters that don't rely on you appealing to them being undereducated. So, for example, when the Democrats win the Senate runoffs in Georgia, they do so by appealing to the Black identity of many voters there, not the undereducated identity of many Black voters who live there, because that would also be incredibly ineffective in getting white people, but they appeal to the existential threat that faces people, Black people, both educated and uneducated, and turn out people from that group, whether or not their education status is in question. The final thing, though, is just to note that their swing seats push is incredibly uncomparative because you still need to win wealthier seats as well in the status quo. Like, they are not the only side that can say, oh, well, we need to win one more seat Because if they win one more seat in an uneducated area, but they lose multiple seats or even one seat in a wealthy area, there's ultimately no gain there whatsoever. Just because something is historic doesn't mean it needs to be, particularly as people become more and more educated into the future. So why do they not win this? And I think that they don't actually ever engage with comparative, that there is competition for undereducated people in this debate, right? These people have voted probably their entire lives for more conservative parties. So they need to prove not only why these policies are appealing, but why they're so appealing that they can get up over the fact these people have bought into conservative rhetoric for the rest of their lives. First thing we tell you is you're probably not going to be good at it. Symbolic references don't mean anything if they don't believe you. And they probably just feel even more ignored because it seems like a massive backfoot from the woke left that they don't trust. They then say that you can run candidates that are more appealing. But again, notably, if you run candidates that are more working class, more appealing, perhaps less woke, you then run into the issue of people who are further left or more educated doom threading on Twitter about how your party has gone to the dogs and it's no longer as progressive as it used to, and turns people away on that route. So they really can't win there. The second thing that we tell you is you cannot win the cultural war against the right. When you do anti-immigration policy like they suggest to you, you don't win anyone who's actually anti-immigrant because the right can always go much more anti-immigrant than you can. The third thing we tell you is that the simplicity of the politics is important. Leah tells you, well, these policies are appealing, but I would also note a lot of the right-wing rhetoric here is appealing, right, as well. So even if you believe that building hospitals is good, the right has told you from your birth that debt is bad and that if we spend more, we'll go into debt and that is bad. And you're told to care about the economy because if the economy is bad, then that is bad for you as well. So just because the ideas are appealing doesn't mean the rhetoric gets past this economic stuff, stuff the right has been saying forever. Finally, we tell you that a lot of media that is free is more conservative and more difficult to access. They just try to tell you that you can fix free media, but it's unclear how they want to tell you to do it whatsoever. When Rupert Murdoch has a majority of the media monopoly in the US, that means that it's something that they cannot just say we would fix. It is not enough for Uday to just claim we will do better because we are the side that is focusing on them, because they don't do better. And in doing so, even if they win an extra 1% of voters that are undereducated, they lose 1% of voters or many more from people who have more time, more money, and can make a bigger difference. For those reasons, we are so proud to oppose.
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech. On to the reply section. I'd like to first invite the negative reply.
First question that you have to ask yourself in this debate is there actually an imperative to change from the series of priorities and the ways that center-left parties try to campaign right now? This motion is not a status quo act. It demands a change. This team has barely quantified what that change looks like, let alone why it is necessary. And note that every example that Uday gives you as to why there have been a series of victories by the center-left in the status quo, which is the world that we defend, does suggest actually that parties are getting it right now. They don't need to appeal more to uneducated voters. They are doing the right amount of appealing right now. That suggests then that there is not an imperative that has justified the risk that this affirmative team demands that you take of losing the coalition that delivered the victory for Biden and for Lula and for every other center-left party that we describe, and they describe as well in the status quo. Because we explain to you, most importantly, that educated voters are far more able to just say, I don't care about this cycle because I am relatively well off. I resent the fact that the party is not heeding to my voice as firmly as it used to, and I will simply not vote for them, or I will vote for a Greens party, or I will decide that actually, you know what, lower taxes this time around sound pretty good to me. Those are all examples of the way that this highly sensitive base can rapidly turn upon you and decide that another priority that matters to them, like their high income, like their environmentalist beliefs, mean that they will simply turn to a different competing party, and those competing parties exist in the vast majority of liberal democracies, pretty much everywhere that isn't the US. Even in Canada and Australia, those alternatives exist, which means then they have not explained why it is that you should focus on the undereducated identity instead of focusing on the other identities that they themselves describe. Like, why is it important to focus on undereducatedness and those problems instead of focusing on queerness or on minority status or on recent migration status? All of those other identities are things that are less alienating to focus on. We explain this in depth down the bench, especially in Ali's speech. So then let's ask ourselves, what does this affirmative team actually gain? the things that they describe are just not high impact. Leah says too, she says you will spend more time with undereducated voters, but it is unclear that you're able to spend more time than conservatives. They never prove that, which suggests that that is not a mechanism that changes anyone's mind. If it is about time and effort, if you cannot beat those conservatives, you gain no one. Then she says we'll take status quo policies and we'll market them in a better way, but she doesn't prove that a lack of awareness is the problem. No one on that team proves that undereducated voters don't know that center leftists want to increase welfare or do other things. So that is not an explanation of change. Then Uday gives two new reasons. You suggest that you would focus on anti-immigration rhetoric, which we tell you probably like preemptively at Tom turns off everyone else in your coalition who depends on migrants for labor and see them as being important and probably think this is a racist bad policy. And then Uday's like, well, we'll run working class candidates, which is just a line with no explanation as to how that process happens or in which areas you would run them. So I don't understand how you get more voters at the end of all of that. Juxtapose that lack of clarity and lack of impact against the harms that we explain to you, because we demonstrate that you lose whenever you lose a single more educated voter, you lose their higher amount of money that they donate to your party, which enables it to do the things like the community outreach that this team cares about. You lose the volunteers that also do the things like engaging with people on a personal level that this team seems to concede is an effective method of changing people's minds. So for every more educated voter that you lose, you don't just lose a vote, you lose a series of resources that are crucial to allow you to campaign at all in the first place, which explains why even if it is 1 for 1, the more educated voters are more valuable to you. But it is not 1 for 1 because for every single time that you change your language, that is something that privileged people pick up on immediately, but you have to do more of it still to penetrate through to lower educated people who don't get to spend as much time doing things like consuming media or reading think pieces. So to make that change, you have to do it a lot. For those reasons, proud to negate.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And lastly, I'd like to invite the affirmative reply.
Sorry, 1 second.
No worries.
All right. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Less educated voters are not worth 1 for 1. They're worth 2 for 1 because they are trending right wing. If you stop them trending right wing, you deny votes to the opposition while winning votes for yourself. As you adjudicate this debate, ask yourself, what would side negative have this actor do? Because they say they want the actor to do what successful left-wing parties do, and they point to some examples, but then they don't really elaborate on what those parties did and the messaging choices they made and the candidates they ran. They then claim that they claim wrongly that in many contexts, educated people are the majority, and so the centre-left parties should just chill, and then at third negative, we get this shift. Oh, we'll just do what Biden did. We'll just do what they did in Georgia. Biden, the candidate who was criticized within the Democratic Party as the single most moderate nominee who did not represent how liberal the party was. In Georgia, where they ran, as we tell you at First Affirmative, more moderate candidates like Raphael Warnock, who pose with police and do not engage in West Wing messaging. Third negative, almost sensing the problem, says, well, you'd lose voters to a left-wing party because you aren't being sufficiently left-wing. Af explained at second and third that you can't capture the most left-wing voters if they belong to if there is another party to your left, because if they are very left-wing voters, by definition, they already vote for the most left-wing party. But two, in many cases, the alternative, affirmative explain, is voting for a right-wing party. We then get more new substantive and neg block. They say, oh, well, you see, you lose donations, you don't get access to all this important money. They never explain what you would do with the money. They just kind of say you would increase turnout, missing the fact that at first affirmative, it is explicitly told you should check your notes, that turnout and amping turnout among the educated base is significantly less important than trying to persuade less educated voters, or trying to persuade less educated voters who, as the info slide says, are drifting right wing, because they are worth more, because they deny the right wing votes when you capture them. Again, the material from first affirmative here is winning. Then they say, they make a series of claims about, you see, and this is where the negative reply starts to get quite clever. They're like, you see, we're already winning. The AF can't support the status quo. You have to explicitly target them. You have to defend a shift. Side affirmative has already responded to this, because they say, one, and this crucially never receives direct response, right? They explain that, one, the structure of these parties pushes them to the left, because the elites within these parties read predominantly liberal media and predominantly interact with the left-wing liberal educated people, which is why they have a poor understanding of what lower educated voters want, which is why you have to make a policy of actively targeting those voters in order to win them over. But it also explained at second affirmative that the right actively target less educated voters because they are often the marginal voter. You have to win them. You have to go out and explicitly target them. You can't just, as the other side seem to want, just kind of sit on your haunches, wait for left-wing parties to continually sweep to power, despite themselves relying on a small set of cherry-picked examples, ignoring examples like this team points to, like the example of the centre-left in France or Italy. In the context where there is most people not being educated, which is a claim they initially contest, but then drop during their block, but I'll explain the structural reasoning affirmative give you, where, one, we point out that most people were born before education rates increased. Two, most people don't get into college because they don't have the marks. Three, most people don't grow up in areas where college is a norm. Four, going to college is expensive and costs you the ability to work full time. And five, most people just, do not share the same social values as the highly educated. So even if it's in summer education, that's not enough. The last gasp is the second negative, where they say that people old and dying off. We respond to this by proving that most young people don't go to college, but we explain that even if that's so, they're going to die off in 20 years. That's a long time, guys, to go without winning an election. This is a team who did not have an answer to what they wanted left-wing parties to do. They wanted them to chill or increase turnout or amp donations. None of it was explained. Compare that to side affirmative, the clarity you heard. We would, one, pick working class, lower educated candidates and candidates who appeal to them. We would, two, adopt positions they liked, like restrictions on immigrations and messaging around healthcare. And we would, three, properly test ads and make winning those votes a priority. That side doesn't do any of that. They are very unclear on what they support, and it's for that reason they lose this.
Thank you very much for that fine speech, and thank you for the debate.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See you at break night.